The Haunting of Maple Grove. Chapter 1. The moving truck lumbered up the dirt driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. Sheriff Evelyn Hayes squinted through the haze of late afternoon sun and swirling dirt particles, getting her first good look at her new home. It was a quaint two-story craftsman at the end of a quiet street in Maple Grove, a picturesque town nestled in the pine-covered hills of Oregon. Evelyn unfolded her lean frame from the driver's seat of the truck, stretched, and surveyed her surroundings. The air smelled of fresh pine and wood smoke. The neighborhood was sleepy. Only the chirping of birds and distant growl of a lawnmower interrupted the tranquility. After the frantic pace and constant noise of city life, the serenity was jarring. "Mommy, look!" squealed a young voice. Evelyn's daughter Lila jumped out of the passenger seat and ran towards the front yard, pigtails bobbing. "They have a treehouse!" Sure enough, a ramshackle structure of weathered boards and rusted nails clung precariously to the branches of a towering oak tree. Evelyn frowned. The treehouse looked like it predated the house. It would have to come down before Lila got any ideas. "Stay out of there until I can check it out," Evelyn warned. Lila pouted but didn't argue, already distracted by a butterfly flitting past. The door of the house swung open and a sturdy, silver-haired woman in a pale blue house dress emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Sheriff Hayes," she called warmly. "I'm Mabel, your landlady. Welcome to Maple Grove." Evelyn crossed the yard and extended her hand. Mabel had a firm, calloused handshake that conveyed a lifetime of hard work. "Nice to meet you, Mabel. This is my daughter Lila. Say hi, honey." "Hi," Lila chirped shyly, half hidden behind Evelyn's leg. Mabel smiled. "Aren't you the cutest thing? I have fresh cookies inside if your mom says it's okay." Evelyn nodded, and Lila dashed for the front door. She turned to grab boxes from the truck, but Mabel caught her elbow. "Now you just relax and let me help you get settled, Sheriff. It's the least I can do after—" Mabel trailed off, her eyes going distant. She blinked and the warmth returned to her face. "Well, we're just real glad to have you is all. Lord knows this town could use some new blood in the sheriff's office." Evelyn tensed. She hadn't told many people the real reason she'd left her detective job in Portland for this small-town sheriff gig, and she hoped it stayed that way. Whatever had happened to the previous sheriff, she wanted a fresh start for her and Lila, free of the shadows of the past. She forced a smile. "I appreciate the warm welcome, Mabel. It's beautiful country out here. I think Lila and I will fit right in." Mabel linked elbows with her as they walked to the house. "Of course you will, dear. Maple Grove is a wonderful place to raise a child. Everyone looks out for each other here. We're like one big happy family." But as they stepped over the threshold into the airy front room, a chill rippled down Evelyn's spine, prickling the hairs on her neck. She cast a quick glance behind her, scanning the yard. Nothing seemed amiss. The street was empty and still, yet Evelyn couldn't shake the uncanny sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, of something sinister crouching in the shadows of this sleepy hamlet, waiting to strike. She shook it off. The paranoia was a holdover from her time on the force in the city, nothing more. She was in Mayberry now, a town so quaint she half expected Sheriff Andy Taylor to welcome her at the police station. Still, as Mabel ushered them inside, nattering on about town gossip, Evelyn found herself scanning the darkened corners and wondering what secrets they held. Wondering if she was truly ready for the fresh start Maple Grove promised, or if she just traded one set of ghosts for another. Chapter 2. The Maple Grove Sheriff's Department was a squat, unassuming brick building just off Main Street. A weathered wooden sign hung above the glass front doors, the paint cracked and peeling. Evelyn climbed the concrete steps, tugging nervously at her new beige uniform. After over a decade working undercover and in plain clothes, the stiff material felt foreign against her skin. She took a deep breath, straightened her sheriff's hat, and pushed open the door. Inside, the cramped front office bustled with activity. A plump, middle-aged woman with frizzy red hair manned the front desk, fielding a barrage of phone calls. Two officers in rumpled uniforms conferred over a messy stack of case files. A waifish teenage girl sporting heavy black eyeliner and a sullen expression slouched in a plastic chair, hands shoved into the pockets of her frayed hoodie. All eyes turned to Evelyn as she entered. Conversation dropped off and the sense of appraisal was palpable. She lifted her chin and approached the front desk. The redhead cupped a hand over the phone receiver. "You must be Sheriff Hayes," she stage whispered. "I'm Jolene, the dispatch coordinator. We've been expecting you." She jerked her head toward a closed door. "Chief Swanson is in his office. Go on in." "Thanks." Evelyn hoped her voice sounded more confident than she felt. She crossed to the door, very aware of the eyes following her, and knocked twice. "Enter!" boomed a gruff voice. She turned the knob and stepped inside. Chief Bill Swanson sat behind a large oak desk, framed by a dusty Oregon flag and a taxidermied buckhead. He was a burly man in his late 50s, with close-cropped steel gray hair, a deeply lined face, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to bore right through her. "Sheriff Hayes," he said by way of greeting, rising to shake her hand. His grip was crushing. "Have a seat." Evelyn perched on the edge of a battered chair, back ramrod straight. Swanson settled his bulk back down with a grunt and fixed her with an appraising stare. "You came highly recommended from Portland PD," he said without preamble. "Your captain raved about your work ethic and investigative skills, said you were the best he'd seen in years." His gaze sharpened. "He also mentioned you'd been through some rough times, said this job would be a good change of pace for you." Evelyn's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, Chief. I'm looking forward to bringing my experience to Maple Grove and making a fresh start for my daughter and me." Swanson grunted, neither approving nor disapproving. "Small-town policing is a different animal than what you're used to in the city. We're a close-knit community. People look out for each other. They expect to know their sheriff, and for their sheriff to know them." "I understand," said Evelyn. "I intend to be very hands-on. Attend community events, get to know the residents, be visible and approachable." "Good." Swanson leaned back, chair creaking. "Your predecessor, Sheriff Hawkins, he was one of us. Born and raised here. Folks trusted him." His gaze turned distant. "What happened to him, ... IT shook us all up pretty bad." A leaden silence fell. Evelyn knew what had happened to the previous sheriff. It had been front-page news even in Portland. A shudder rippled through her as she recalled the grisly details. Swanson cleared his throat. "Well, you're here now, and I expect you to do us proud. Serve the people of Maple Grove, keep them safe, and uphold the law." He pinned her with a penetrating stare. "And Hayes, you ever need anything, my door is always open. We take care of our own here." His words were kind, but Evelyn sensed the steel behind them. This was a man used to being obeyed, and she would do well not to cross him. "Thank you, Chief," she said. "I won't let you down." "See that you don't." Swanson nodded toward the door. "Jolene will get you settled and partnered up with Officer Ramos. He'll show you the ropes. Appreciate you coming in on a Saturday to get started." Dismissed, Evelyn stood. "Happy to, sir. I'm eager to hit the ground running." But as she turned to leave, Swanson's parting words stopped her cold. "One more thing, Hayes. You're going to hear things about this town, stories. People who've lived here a long time, they believe in a lot of folklore and superstition." A chill skittered down Evelyn's spine despite herself. "What kind of folklore?" Swanson waved a meaty hand. "Old settler tales, native legends, that kind of thing. Dark stuff, about blood rituals and spirits in the woods. It's nonsense, but folks cling tight to it. You just shut it down if it comes up, you hear? Last thing we need is people riled up over ghost stories." "Of course, Chief," Evelyn managed around a suddenly dry throat. "I don't put much stock in ghost stories." But as she exited the stifling office into the cacophony of the bullpen, Evelyn couldn't shake the cold tendril of dread curling in her gut, the sensation of hurtling toward something dark and dangerous, something she couldn't begin to understand. The feeling that in Maple Grove the ghost stories just might be real. Chapter 3. And on your right, you'll see our famous Maple Grove Diner, home of the best cherry pie in 3 counties, or so the owner Earl will tell you. Officer Jake Ramos grinned from the driver's seat of the cruiser as he pointed out Maple Grove's lone restaurant. He was young for a cop, no more than 25, with an easy smile and puppy dog enthusiasm. "Let me guess," said Evelyn wryly. "It's also the town's main social hub and unofficial gossip mill." Jake laughed. "Got it in one, Sheriff. You can't swing a cat in this town without hitting someone who's related to Earl or owes him money." They were driving slowly down Main Street, Jake giving Evelyn the grand tour. It was like something out of a postcard. Quaint brick storefronts, American flags fluttering from every lamppost, not a piece of litter in sight. Townsfolk waved cheerily as the cruiser rolled past, calling out greetings. "Seems like you're quite the celebrity," Evelyn observed. Jake shrugged, ducking his head. "Grew up here, was a bit of a wild child in my teen years. Folks were pretty shocked when I turned things around and got into law enforcement." "What made you want to become a cop?" asked Evelyn, genuinely curious. Jake didn't seem the type. A shadow passed over his open face. "When I was 17, my kid sister Rosie went missing. Just up and vanished from a slumber party one night. Cops never found a trace of her." "I'm so sorry," said Evelyn softly. The pain in his voice made her heart ache. Jake's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Afterward, I was angry. At the cops, at the town, at myself. I spiraled pretty hard. But then I realized I could either self-destruct or try to make a difference. Try to prevent what happened to Rosie from happening to anyone else." "That's very admirable," said Evelyn. "I think your sister would be proud of you." Jake shot her a grateful look. "I like to think so." He cleared his throat. "Anyway, that's my sob story. What brings you to our neck of the woods, city girl? Can't be the exciting nightlife." Evelyn hesitated, considering how much to reveal. Jake seemed like a good kid, but she'd learned the hard way about trusting too quickly. "Like I told the chief, I needed a change of scenery," she said carefully. "Big city policing can wear you down. When I saw the opening here, it felt like a chance to make a difference in a community. Somewhere I could raise my daughter away from the chaos." It was a tidy half-truth, and Jake accepted it with a nod. "Fair enough, but I gotta ask. You know what happened to your predecessor, right? I'd understand if that gave you second thoughts." Evelyn suppressed a shudder, recalling the news coverage. "I read the reports. Animal attack, wasn't it? A stray cougar or something?" "That's the official story," said Jake grimly. "But the body... Sheriff, I've seen Animal Planet. What happened to Hawkins was no cougar." Unease prickled Evelyn's scalp. "What do you mean?" Jake wet his lips, eyes darting to the dense tree line flanking the road. He dropped his voice to a whisper. "The body was torn to shreds. Claw marks, sure, but also symbols. Carved into his skin. Occult stuff, like something out of a devil worship manual. And the blood ... IT looked like it had been drained." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Occult symbols? Was it some kind of ritualized killing?" "That's what I thought at first. Did some digging into the town history, looking for similar cases." "And?" Evelyn prompted when he fell silent. "What did you find?" Jake shook his head, jaw clenched. "Records going back over a century. Unexplained deaths, disappearances, all with the same pattern. Mutilated bodies, strange symbols. Trails of blood leading into the woods. And it all centers on one thing." "What thing?" Evelyn whispered, though she feared she already knew the answer. "The old mining settlement," said Jake, and a chill passed through the car. "The original town of Maple Grove, before they discovered the ore and relocated closer to the hills. The place has been abandoned for decades, but the stories about it..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "What stories?" "They say something evil lives in those woods. Something that's always lurked there long before the first loggers and prospectors set foot. Something hungry. And every few decades, when the signs align, ... IT feeds." Evelyn sat very still, her mind reeling. She wanted to dismiss Jake's words as backwoods superstition, the fanciful imaginings of a town with too much time on its hands. But she was a cop, and cops dealt in facts. And the fact was, Hawkins's death didn't add up. Nor did the pattern Jake described going back decades. Ritualized murders didn't just happen in a vacuum. Where there was smoke, there was often fire. And right now the smoke billowing from Maple Grove's past was looking more and more like an inferno. Chapter 4. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and paperwork. Evelyn met what felt like every officer, administrator, and civilian contractor in the small department. She stumbled over names and ranks, knowing she'd need a cheat sheet to keep them straight. It was early evening by the time she pulled up to Mabel's house, her mind whirling and her stomach growling. The delicious scent of frying chicken wafted from the kitchen windows, and Lila erupted from the front door in a pink ruffled apron, squealing in delight. Mommy, guess what? Miss Mabel is teaching me to cook. We made fried chicken and biscuits, and I even got to roll out the dough. Evelyn scooped her daughter into a hug, heart swelling at her unrestrained joy. That's wonderful, sweetie. I can't wait to taste it. She glanced up to see Mabel beaming from the porch. You didn't have to go to all this trouble, Mabel. We could have just ordered pizza. Mabel flapped a dish towel at her. Nonsense. Cooking is no trouble. It's a joy to have a youngster in the kitchen again. Keeps me spry. She winked at Lila. Us girls gotta stick together, right, Pumpkin? Right, Lila chirped. She grabbed Evelyn's hand, tugging her toward the house. Come on, Mommy, it's almost ready. Evelyn let herself be led, basking in her daughter's unfettered happiness. It had been a long time since she'd seen Lila so animated, so carefree. Not since... She pushed the dark thoughts away. That was the past. They were making a fresh start here, and she wouldn't let the shadows of yesterday dim Lila's bright future. Dinner was a lively affair, with Lila chattering nonstop about her day exploring the yard and helping Mabel with chores. The food was delicious: crispy golden chicken, fluffy buttermilk biscuits, creamy mashed potatoes dripping with gravy. Evelyn ate until she thought she'd burst, savoring every home-cooked morsel. Afterward, Lila scampered off to take a bubble bath, and Evelyn insisted on doing the dishes over Mabel's protests. As she scraped and rinsed, Mabel puttered around the kitchen, putting away leftovers and wiping counters. I can't thank you enough for watching Lila today, said Evelyn. I know it was last minute. I hated to ask, but our regular sitter is back in Portland, and I didn't know who else to call. It was no bother at all, dear, said Mabel warmly. I adore children, and Lila is a treasure. Reminds me of my own grandbabies at that age. Evelyn glanced at the framed photos lining the walls, snapshots of grinning, tow-headed children in various stages of growth. Do they live nearby? I'd love to set up a playdate for Lila. Mabel got a faraway look in her eye. Oh, they're all grown up now, scattered to the four winds. The youngest is off at college in New York, if you can believe it. I don't get to see them as much as I'd like. I'm sorry, said Evelyn, sensing a sore subject. I'm sure they miss you too. Mabel gave a misty smile. She picked up a dish towel and began drying the clean plates. For a few minutes they worked in companionable silence, the only sound the clink of china and slosh of sudsy water. Then Mabel spoke, her tone carefully casual. I heard on the scanner that you and Jake went for a drive today. See anything interesting? Evelyn stilled, taken aback by the question. Not really. He just showed me around town a bit, pointed out the hot spots. Why? Mabel shrugged, gaze fixed on the plate she was drying. Oh, no reason. I just wondered if he might have taken you by the old mining settlement is all. A chill skittered up Evelyn's spine. She studied Mabel's profile, trying to read her expression. He mentioned it in passing, said the area had some dark history. Do you know anything about that? Mabel set the plate down with exaggerated care. She turned to Evelyn, and there was something haunted in her eyes. There are a lot of stories about those woods, old stories passed down from the early days of Maple Grove. Most folks don't like to talk about them. What kind of stories? Mabel's fingers twisted in the dish towel. Stories of things in the forest, unnatural things. The settlers they knew to stay clear of that area, especially on certain days of the year, said it was cursed land stained by blood magic and old gods. Evelyn's heart tripped in her chest. Blood magic, occult symbols, just like what Jake had described at the crime scenes. Do you believe those stories, Mabel? The older woman looked away. I've lived in Maple Grove my whole life. I know there are truths in this town that go beyond what the eye can see. She took a shuddering breath. But I also know that stirring up the shadows does no good. The past is best left buried. She leveled Evelyn with a piercing stare. You're a good woman, Sheriff Hayes. You've got a pure heart and a strong mind. My advice? Focus on the here and now, on serving the fine people of Maple Grove and raising that beautiful daughter of yours. Let sleeping dogs lie." With that cryptic warning, Mabel hung up her towel and bid Evelyn good night. Evelyn stood at the sink, hands dripping soapy water, mind churning with unanswered questions. What secrets was Mabel hiding? What did she know about the darkness lurking in Maple Grove's past? And did it have anything to do with Sheriff Hawkins' murder? Evelyn had never been one to heed "let sleeping dogs lie," not when there were monsters to slay and innocents to protect. She thought of Lila splashing happily in the tub down the hall, blissfully oblivious to the shadows nipping at their heels. She would keep her daughter safe, no matter the cost. Whatever evil stalked Maple Grove's woods, Evelyn would drag it into the light. That was the duty she'd sworn, the burden of the badge, even if it meant staring into the abyss of the town's darkest secrets and praying she didn't blink first. Chapter 5. The next few weeks passed in a hectic blur as Evelyn settled into her new role. She quickly learned that small-town sheriffing was less about solving crimes and more about resolving petty disputes and acting as a one-woman social services agency. She mediated quarrels over fence lines and loose livestock. She tracked down runaway teens and talked down drunks who'd gotten too rowdy at the lone bar. She performed welfare checks on shut-in elderly residents and chaperoned a high school dance when the PTA came up short on volunteers. It was unglamorous, often tedious work, but Evelyn found she didn't mind. There was something satisfying about being a visible, vital part of the community, about making a concrete difference in people's lives, even in small ways. The townsfolk seemed to appreciate her efforts. Shopkeepers greeted her by name as she walked her beat, pressing cups of coffee and slices of pie into her hands. Parents flagged her down to compliment her traffic control at school drop-offs and pickups. Even the sullen teenagers slouching on street corners tipped their chins in grudging respect when she passed. But even as she ingratiated herself to the residents of Maple Grove, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, of some intangible barrier between her and the born and bred locals, a veil of history and secrets she wasn't privy to. It was there in the way conversations would hush when she entered the diner, in the sidelong looks and awkward pauses when she pressed for information on past incidents. In the politely evasive non-answers she received to even innocuous questions about the town's history. Maple Grove was hiding something. Evelyn could feel it, an electric crackle just beneath the Rockwellian surface. And the more she probed, the more certain she became that it had everything to do with the abandoned mining settlement and the gruesome cycle of unsolved murders stretching back over a century. But hard evidence was maddeningly scarce. The case files on Sheriff Hawkins's death were frustratingly thin, all references to occult symbols and ritualized mutilations scrubbed from the official reports. The older files Jake had described were nowhere to be found, not even in the dustiest corners of the basement archives. Nor could she rely on her colleagues for information. Jake, so eager to spill the town's secrets that first day, now clammed up whenever she brought up the topic, mumbling excuses about getting back to his paperwork. Even gregarious, gossipy Jolene grew frosty and closed off when Evelyn tried to steer their conversations toward Maple Grove's hidden past. "There are some things better off not knowing," she said cryptically when Evelyn pushed. "Stones best left unturned." It was infuriating, this wall of silence. Evelyn knew she was an outsider, but she was still the sheriff. She had a right to answers, a duty to pursue the truth. But truthfully, it wasn't just professional frustration fueling her mounting obsession. It was fear, cold, clawing fear for her daughter's safety. Because the more dead ends Evelyn hit, the more certain she became that the evil stalking Maple Grove wasn't some abstract bogeyman. It was real, it was hungry, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. That certainty crystallized one rainy night when a call crackled over the radio. An 1199, officer needs assistance. All units to respond. Evelyn's blood ran cold as Jake's staticky voice filled the cruiser. "I'm at the old mining settlement. Multiple bodies. So much blood. It quote S.IT quote S, just like Hawkins." She slapped the siren and peeled out of the station lot, heart in her throat. The old mining settlement. Jake. Bodies. It was happening again, the nightmare cycle repeating. She pushed the accelerator to the floor, tires shrieking on the slick roads. She had to get there, had to see for herself, had to confront this faceless evil before it could slink back into the shadows. The cruiser fishtailed wildly as she veered off the main road onto the narrow forest track, branches scraping the windows. She barely noticed, pulse pounding in her ears. Images flashed in her mind. Hawkins's ravaged body, occult symbols carved in flesh, a blood trail leading into the dark woods. She floored the brakes as the cruiser burst into the clearing of the old mining settlement. Jake's patrol car sat empty, driver's door ajar. 2 more cruisers idled nearby, their emergency lights eerily still. Heart hammering, Evelyn drew her gun and stepped out into the driving rain. The clearing was empty, silent save for the patter of drops on leaves. "Jake," she called hoarsely. "Anyone here?" Her only answer was a low, keening wail rising from the depths of the forest, a sound no animal should make, shrill and agonized and terribly, dreadfully human. Evelyn's blood turned to ice in her veins. Gun shaking in suddenly nerveless fingers, she stepped toward the tree line and the unspeakable horror she knew awaited in the darkness beyond. Chapter 6. The forest closed around Evelyn like the maw of some great beast, all-consuming and inescapable. Rain lashed her face and plastered her hair to her scalp as she picked her way through the dense undergrowth, fighting to keep her gun steady. The unnatural keening rose and fell in undulating waves, setting her teeth on edge. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, impossible to pinpoint. The wail of some creature in unbearable agony, or unholy ecstasy. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she strained her eyes against the gloom. Every shadow leapt and twisted in the quavering beam of her flashlight, conjuring nightmarish shapes that vanished when she looked head-on. She was flying blind, chasing ghosts and monsters into the dark heart of Maple Grove's secret history. Every iota of her police training screamed at her to turn back, to call for backup and cordon off the area until she had the manpower and intelligence to mount a proper search. But there was no time. Jake was out here somewhere, along with God knew what else, the thing in the woods, the hungry presence that had stalked this town for generations, claiming its tithe of blood and terror. She had to end this, here and now, before the shadows swallowed another innocent soul, before the cycle could begin anew. The keening swelled until it was all Evelyn could hear, drowning out even her own labored breaths and pounding pulse. It filled her skull, vibrated in her bones, a siren song of madness and ruin. And then, between one blink and the next, the trees fell away and she stumbled into a clearing that shouldn't exist. It was a perfect circle of barren earth, 30 feet in diameter. The ground was scoured down to bedrock, not a single blade of grass or seedling pine marring its unnatural smoothness. At the center of the clearing stood a towering oak tree, gnarled and ancient, its leaves glistening black in the beam of her flashlight. Bone-white stones protruded from the soil at its base, too regular in shape and placement to be natural. It took Evelyn's horror-fogged brain a disbelieving moment to realize what she was seeing. Gravestones, dozens of them, jutting from the earth in concentric circles around the tree like a macabre fairy ring, and at the foot of the great oak, splayed in a spreading pool of gore, "Jake!" The name tore from Evelyn's throat, barely recognizable as human speech. He lay on his side, sightless eyes wide with terror, mouth gaping in a silent scream. His throat gaped in a second, bloody grin, nearly severing his head. His abdomen was a ruin of shredded flesh and gleaming viscera, and carved into the skin of his bare chest, still weeping rivulets of crimson, were symbols. Arcane sigils that made Evelyn's eyes ache to behold, alien and unspeakably ancient. A sob hitched in her chest as she staggered forward, knowing it was futile even as she pressed shaking fingers to Jake's tacky, cooling skin. The light had long gone out of his eyes, the blood congealing in the abattoir of his body. She was too late, just like with Hawkins, just like the countless others stretching back over the centuries, the ones whose names and faces had been scoured from the record as thoroughly as the ground of this clearing had been scoured of life. scoured by something so anathema to the natural order that the very earth rejected its presence. Evelyn raised her head, raindrops mingling with the tears on her cheeks. The keening had fallen silent when she entered the clearing, leaving only the incessant drum of rain on leaves. But she could feel it watching. The dark presence lurking beyond the veil of this world, peering through the crack that had opened in the circle of graves. The hungry ones, the ravening shadow, the demon of Maple Grove's living nightmare. It had no name, this ancient evil, no true form that mortal minds could comprehend without shattering. But she could sense its coiled malice, the simmering glee of a predator toying with its next meal. It had devoured Jake. Hawkins, untold others over the long centuries, a glut of blood and terror to sate its unending hunger. And now it wanted her, the interloper, the outsider who dared to challenge its supremacy, who'd had the temerity to shine a light into the shadows of its long reign. The leaves of the great oak shivered, though no wind penetrated the eerie stillness of the clearing. The shadows deepened until they were more than an absence of light. They were living pools of obsidian, writhing with spectral faces and grasping claws. Evelyn raised her gun, aiming for the heart of the darkness with trembling hands. She knew it was futile, knew the bullets would pass through that abyss like motes of dust. But it was all she had, her duty, her responsibility. To go down fighting, even in the face of the abyss. To be the light, even as the shadows swallowed her whole. "Come on then, you bastard," she whispered through numb lips. "Come and get me." The shadows lunged, and Evelyn's world exploded in a maelstrom of agony and oblivion. Chapter 7. Evelyn clawed her way back to consciousness through a red haze of pain. Every nerve ending shrieked, every muscle locked in a rictus of agony. She tasted blood, felt the crunch of leaf matter beneath her cheek. Awareness returned in shattered fragments, puzzle pieces that refused to fit. The gnarled roots of the great oak digging into her spine. The jagged remnants of the magic circle scattered by some unimaginable force. Jake's corpse, sprawled just out of reach, eyes milky and accusing in death. And above it all, the sounds, wet, rending, cracking. The grisly noises of a butcher's shop, of meat being torn from bone by ravenous teeth. Evelyn tried to move, to lift her head and confront the source of those awful sounds. But her body wouldn't respond, paralyzed by more than pain and terror. It was here, the thing from the shadows, the abomination spawned of blood magic and human terror. She could feel its presence like a gravity well, pulling at her mind, hungering for her essence. A shape moved in her blurred periphery, dark and glistening. It crouched over Jake's body, back hunched and arms working in savage jerks. Viscous red ropes clung to its muzzle as it lifted its head, jagged teeth bared in a rictus grin. Not it, he. For even ravaged by corruption, warped into a grotesque parody of life, Evelyn recognized the visage of her predecessor. Sheriff Hawkins, or the thing that had once been him, stared at her with eyes like pits, black voids that swallowed sanity. He was a ruin of ruptured flesh and protruding bone, barely recognizable as human. His skin hung in tattered strips, revealing pulsing masses of black rot beneath. Symbols carved themselves across his body in endlessly shifting patterns, weeping, corrupted ichor. The thing that had been Hawkins lurched to its feet, bits of Jake's flesh dangling from its jaws. It shambled toward Evelyn, movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette dancing on tangled strings. Evelyn tried to scream, to bring her gun to bear, but her body remained a dead, unresponsive husk. She could only watch in mute horror as the creature closed the distance, black tongue lolling between needled teeth. It crouched over her, carrion breath hot on her face. One taloned hand caressed her cheek in obscene tenderness, smearing rancid gore across her skin. "Welcome, Sheriff," it croaked, vocal cords shredded to ribbons. "We've been waiting for you." Tears of revulsion spilled down Evelyn's temples, the only movement she could muster. The creature cocked its head, skeletal digits dancing over her prone form. "You came seeking answers," it rasped, seeking to unravel the secret history woven into Maple Grove's roots, to cast light upon the shadows that sustain it. It leaned close, lipless mouth brushing her ear in a grotesque parody of intimacy. "You found more than you bargained for, didn't you? More than your mortal mind can bear without shattering." Evelyn whimpered as a tongue like razor wire traced the pulse hammering in her throat. Please," she managed through nerveless lips. "Don't." The thing laughed, a wet, gurgling rattle. "You misunderstand, Sheriff. I'm not going to kill you. Not yet." It seized her chin in a crushing grip, forcing her to meet its bottomless gaze. "I'm going to show you the truth you crave, the secrets buried beneath centuries of blood and terror. I will peel back the comforting veil of your reality and make you see." The symbols carved into its flesh began to glow, pulsing with eldritch bioluminescence. They flowed down its arms, its talons, searing themselves into Evelyn's skin. She convulsed as unholy scouring energy poured into her, tearing at the tattered edges of her psyche. Witness the birth of your precious maple grove, the blood pact that sowed corruption into the soil and bound the town to our hungers. Share the memories, the gnosis branded into the souls of your forebears. Images slammed into Evelyn's mind, overwhelming thought, identity, self. Alien vistas of obsidian spires and roiling shadow stuff, vistas that devoured sanity. Chanting figures in red-spattered robes, names that seared the tongue, the copper tang of blood and burning meat. Screaming, begging, the crunch of shattered bones and tearing of flesh. And through it all, an hunger. Vast, bottomless, devouring. The unending void at the center of being, the maw that gaped behind the mask of reality. It pulled at her, eager to feast, to fill the howling nothingness with her agony and despair. Evelyn felt herself unraveling, the threads of her being fraying apart. Madness gibbered at the edges of her shattering mind, alien and incomprehensible. She was drowning in horror, in violation, in the corrosive certainty of her own cosmic insignificance. "Do you see now, Sheriff?" The thing purred, cradling her slack face in gore-streaked hands. "Do you understand the beautiful truth behind the lie of Maple Grove? You are a mote caught in a web millennia in the weaving. You cannot escape. You can only surrender." It lowered its dripping jaws to her throat, teeth poised to rip and rend. "Give yourself to us, to the ravening dark. Be the willing sacrifice that feeds our glory. It is the only way your story can end, the only mercy we can offer." Darkness roared in to claim her, shot through with ribbons of tainted crimson. The last remnants of Evelyn Hayes crumbled away, swallowed by shadows and shrieking madness. She thought of Lila in that final moment, pictured her daughter's sunny smile and tinkling laughter. A single point of light in the endless abyss. Then the thing that had been Sheriff Hawkins tore out her throat in a welter of blood, and Evelyn knew no more. Chapter 8. Awareness returned slowly, in fits and starts. The first thing Evelyn registered was the cold. Bone-deep, marrow-freezing cold, like the grave had already claimed her. The second was the pain, not the searing agony of her last waking moments, but a persistent, tooth-grinding ache that radiated from 1,000 cuts and contusions. Her body felt like one giant bruise, every nerve raw and inflamed. She pried gummy eyelids open, blinking through a red-tinged haze. She was lying on her back on damp-packed earth, staring up at the knotted branches of the great oak. Watery sunlight filtered through the leaves, a weak and sickly illumination that only highlighted the shadow's depths. With effort, she rolled her head to the side. Jake's body lay a few feet away, still and cold in the rigor of death. His sightless eyes stared into the middle distance, mouth agape in an expression of terminal horror. There was no sign of the thing that had been Sheriff Hawkins, no sign of anything living in the barren clearing, save for the insects already buzzing around Jake's oozing corpse. Evelyn's throat clicked as she tried to swallow, her mouth cotton dry. Her hands scrabbled weakly at her neck, feeling for torn flesh, gaping wounds, but the skin was smooth and intact beneath the crackle of dried blood. No ragged punctures, no ripped esophagus. She wasn't dead. Despite the thing's ravening hunger, the brutal violation of her mind and body, she was still breathing, still aware if not entirely sane. But for how much longer? With a groan, Evelyn levered herself to a sitting position. The world spun lazily around her, and she retched, bringing up nothing but stringy bile. She felt hollowed out in every sense, scoured body and soul by the horrors she'd witnessed. The visions the creature had forced upon her swirled in her mind's eye, a kaleidoscope of depravity and madness. She saw the founding of Maple Grove through its malevolent lens, the pact sealed in blood and forbidden sorcery, the eldritch entities invoked to anchor corruption into the land itself. Century upon century of murder and twisted sacrifice, all to slake the hungers of the ravening dark. She understood now the rotten foundation upon which the town had been built, the nightmare logic underlying its placid surface. Maple Grove was a shell, a flimsy stage set erected to disguise the churning abyss at its heart, and every living soul within its borders danced on strings, puppets helpless to resist the pull of their darkest impulses, even her, especially her. The interloper, the skeptic determined to cast light on the town's shadows. She'd been marked from the moment she set foot in Maple Grove, a sheep fattened for the slaughter. But not just her. Lila, her precious daughter, her reason for living. The thing had shown Evelyn the fate that awaited Lila, the role the innocent child was destined to play in the great and terrible workings of the hungry ones. Sobs racked Evelyn's battered frame as she struggled to her feet. She couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let her baby be devoured by the same corruption that had claimed Jake Hawkins herself. She had to get to Lila, had to grab her and run as far and fast from this accursed place as she could. But where could they run that the shadow couldn't follow? Its tendrils were sunk deep into the soil, into reality itself. Maple Grove was a nexus, a festering knot of otherworldly wrongness. But it was only one tether of the web that ensnared the world entire. There had to be a way. Some slim hope of escape, of severing the ties that bound them to the puppeteers in the dark. But to find it, Evelyn would have to dig deeper, to peel back the scabs of history and face the suppurating malignancy beneath. She needed answers, needed a way to fight, to wield the light against the ravening shadow. And she knew of only one place to find such forbidden knowledge: the old mining settlement, the birthplace of Maple Grove's corruption, where the blood pact had first been sealed, where the veil between worlds ran thinnest, and the hungry ones pressed closest. She would descend into that primordial darkness, confront the truth of what dwelled there. She would barter with monsters and traffic with blasphemies. She would damn her eternal soul, if that was the price of Lila's salvation. Evelyn retrieved her gun from where it had fallen, hands shaking but grip sure. She spared one last glance at Jake's corpse, at the empty meat that had once been a friend, an ally. Then she limped from that cursed clearing into the dying light of a Maple Grove autumn, into the abyss to save the only light that still mattered, the only innocent soul in this fallen world, her daughter, her Lila, no matter the cost. Chapter 9. The old mining settlement hunched like a rotting carcass amid the looming pines, exuding an aura of desolation and decay. Ramshackle buildings sagged beneath the weight of decades, their weathered timbers as porous as moth-eaten cloth. Broken glass glinted dully in vacant windows, jagged teeth in gaping maws. Evelyn picked her way through the debris-strewn streets, the crunch of her footfalls echoing in the preternatural hush. The place had been abandoned long ago, surrendered to the forest's inexorable advance. Scrawny saplings jutted from buckled sidewalks, while climbing vines strangled decaying walls. Nature reclaimed its own, but there was no beauty in this reclamation. Only an oppressive sense of wrongness, a miasma of despair and old evil. It hung in the air like a physical thing, clogging Evelyn's lungs and coating her tongue with bitterness. This was the heart of darkness, the epicenter of corruption from which Maple Grove's shadows spun. She could feel the weight of malevolent history pressing down on her, the psychic residue of centuries of atrocity. Every instinct screamed at her to flee this unhallowed ground, to claw her way back to sanity and sunlight. But she couldn't, not without answers, without some faint hope of saving Lila from the fate woven for her on the hungry one's loom. So she pressed on, following the tug of dread purpose. It led her to the moldering husk of the old miners' hall, sagging at the edge of a weed-choked square. The building seemed to teeter on the brink of collapse, yet an aura of eldritch power thrummed from its lightless windows, its padlocked doors ensorcelled with rust-encrusted chains. This was the place, the sanctum in which the first blood pact had been sealed, spawning a legacy of recurring horror, where forbidden tomes and blasphemous secrets had been guarded through the generations by a cult of degenerate human servitors. The Order of the Obsidian Hollow, the creature had named them in its visions, warped and willing thralls of the entities they called the Ravening Dark, the Hungry Ones, and the inheritors of that abhorrent tradition still held sway in Maple Grove, cloaked in respectability and pious hypocrisy. Pillars of the community by day, debased celebrants of eldritch obscenities by night, all working in concert to maintain the great and terrible lie, to keep their neighbors' placid sheep for the slaughter. Chief Swanson, the mayor, the principal of Lila's school, even Mabel with her grandmotherly smiles and poison apple pies. How far did the rot extend? How many faces of trust concealed writhing maggots beneath? Evelyn wouldn't have believed it possible mere days ago, would have dismissed such insinuations as lunatic ravings. But she'd seen behind the veil now, tasted the bitter rind of truth. She knew in her shredded soul that the world was a far darker, more malevolent place than most dared imagine, and if she wanted any hope of navigating its treacherous shoals, of shielding her daughter from the nightmare pact that would claim her, Evelyn needed the knowledge locked behind that ensorcelled door, the secret annals of the Order's compact with the outer dark. Her hands shook as she reached for the chains, ancient iron searing her palms. Some vestigial corner of her mind gibbered a warning, shrilling of dire consequence and damnation. To breach this seal was to cross a Rubicon, to forfeit any claim to the light. But that light had already failed her, failed Lila. What use was clinging to tattered virtue when oblivion gaped beneath their feet? "I'm sorry, baby," Evelyn whispered, hot tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks. "Mommy has to do this, has to play the monster to keep you safe. Please forgive me." With a scream of rusted agony, the chains shattered beneath her desperate grip. The padlock clattered to the rotting boards, oozing tainted ichor from its shattered ward runes, and the door swung inward on shrieking hinges, belching a gust of stale, sepulchral air. Darkness uncoiled from that abyssal threshold, glutinous and hungering. A low, atonal thrum shivered in the bones of the earth, the shuddersome pulse of nightmare engines. Evelyn stood on the precipice, the annihilating void yawning before her. She thought of Lila's sunny smile, her tinkling laughter, the way her small hand felt trusting and warm in her own. Then she stepped over the threshold, into the abyss, and the darkness swallowed her whole, an eager tide of damnation and despair. God forgive her. God forgive them all. Chapter 10. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable. It pressed against Evelyn's eyes like a smothering velvet shroud, obliterating all sense of distance or dimension. She groped blindly ahead, hands outstretched in futile warding, half convinced she'd been swallowed into some lightless hell dimension. But then, as her foot crossed an invisible bound, pale foxfire bloomed in the abyss. Sickly green radiance limned the contours of a cavernous chamber, pulsing with each shuddersome throb of that atonal resonance. The light shimmered off dank, dripping walls, puddling on a floor inscribed with eye-watering angles and glyphs that seemed to crawl with a loathsome semblance of life, and everywhere on every mildewed surface the detritus of centuries of blasphemous worship. Stained altars crusted with the brown patina of old blood, spiked implements of ritual torture, clotted with nameless residues, serried ranks of glassy-eyed idols, their non-Euclidean geometries painful to behold. At the chamber's heart squatted a basalt slab that could only be an altar, its pitted surface awash in that corpse-like glow. And on that altar, bound by chains that pulsed with ebon radiance, lay an ancient tome that made Evelyn's gorge rise in instinctive revulsion. Its cover was flayed human skin, pebbled with age and stretched over knobby bits of bone. Sigils had been branded into that tanned hide, scribed in necrotic ink that looked suspiciously like old blood. They seemed to move of their own volition, forming words in a language the human tongue was never meant to speak. The Revelations of Glaaki in the Obsidian Tongue of Kna. The tome's title seared itself into Evelyn's mind in a flash of gnosis, even as her sanity gibbered to behold it. This was the Order's most sacred and profane relic, the keystone of their compact with the entities that lurked beyond the veil. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached for the book. The chains that bound it were icy to the touch, their links pitted and flaking with otherworldly corrosion. They parted easily at her questing touch, slithering to the altar like oil-slick serpents. And then the tome was in her hands, its pitted leather hideously warm and pliant. It pulsed like a diseased organ, the sigils writhing across its surface in obscene invitation. Revulsion and dread curdled in Evelyn's gut, but beneath it, a morbid fascination, a hunger to know, to understand, even as the abyss gaped wide to swallow her. With a shuddering breath, she cracked the cover. The vellum pages crinkled like ancient desiccated skin, shedding flakes of eldritch ink. Spidery script in a dozen dead tongues marched across those pages, interspersed with gut-churning illuminations and diagrams of spheres and angles that made her eyes water. And as Evelyn stared into that well of forbidden knowledge, it stared back into her. Hideous truths uncoiled in her mind, seizing her in a psychic vice. She saw the pact that had damned Maple Grove, inscribed in the blood and souls of its founding families. Saw the ravening dark glutting on the fear and pain of generations, its hunger never sated. She saw the Order's workings down the centuries, their degenerate rites and obscene offerings, innocents flayed and devoured in the name of gods that should never be woken, broken minds and shattered lives, all to slake the shadow's thirst. And she saw what awaited her Lila, her sweet, precious daughter, bound to the hungry ones by an ancestral debt of blood and madness, the pawn in a game whose rules violated every natural law. On the tome's pages, in words of bile and shadow, Evelyn read her daughter's doom. Lila was to be the vessel, the mortal shell through which the ravening dark would enter the material plane, an innocent soul hollowed out and filled with primordial malice, annihilating identity and volition until only the outer gods remained. The ritual was set for the night of the blood moon, when the stars aligned to thin the veil between realms. In a charnel pit once known as Maple Grove, Lila's mind and body would be shattered, remade in the image of the hungry ones. She would become a conduit for their eternal hunger, an extension of their incomprehensible will. And reality would bleed. Sobs racked Evelyn's frame as the awful truth crashed over her. The vice of forbidden knowledge tightened, threatening to crack her skull with the weight of its malice. She wanted to gouge out her eyes, to unsee the horrors seared into her psyche. But she couldn't, for in those blood-scrawled pages, she also found a whisper of hope. A chance, however slim, to thwart the ravening dark's design and save Lila from the fate woven for her. The pact that bound Maple Grove was potent, but not inviolable. Like any contract, it had its loopholes, its pressure points that a clever and desperate mind could exploit. The Revelations of Glaaki held the key, a ritual of severing, a way to cut the strings that made them all dance to the shadow's tune. But the price, dear God, the price. With shaking fingers, Evelyn traced the blasphemous runes. Her lips moved in a silent litany, committing the awful formula to memory. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her resolve hardened to a cutting edge. For Lila, she would pay it, would walk into the abyss with eyes wide open and make the sacrifices no loving mother should ever have to make. She would descend into the pit and face the hungry ones. She would match her will against the ravening dark, and she would triumph, or reality would burn. Evelyn closed the tome with a skin-crawling thud. She tucked it under her arm, its malign weight an anchor against the clawing tides of madness. Then she turned and strode from that crypt of eldritch lore, a figure of blood and shadow backlit by sickly luminance. Back to Maple Grove, that charnel pit of secrets. Back to the daughter who needed her, the innocent, unwitting lamb. She had a ritual to prepare, and a world to save or damn, and may God have mercy on them all. Chapter 11. Rain slashed from a bruised dark sky as Evelyn turned onto Mabel's street, a deluge of biblical proportions. It hammered on the cruiser's roof, and turned the road to a river of filthy, churning mud. The world felt poised on a precipice, hanging over a yawning chasm of primal chaos. In the passenger seat beside her, the revelations of Glaaki pulsed with a sickly inner light. Its sigils crawled across the cover, forming obscene patterns that made Evelyn's eyes hurt and her sanity fray. The ritual of severing weighed heavily on her mind, a burden of terrible and inescapable purpose. She was committed now, set on a course with no way back. All that remained was to gather the final component and pray to a merciless God for strength. Evelyn pulled up outside Mabel's quaint little house, tires squelching in the mire. The windows blazed with cheery light, mocking the storm's fury and the darkness that rode in Evelyn's heart. The tome tucked securely under her slicker, she splashed to the front door and knocked. The warm yellow light that spilled out as it opened stabbed her eyes like knives after so long in shadow. "Evelyn!" Mabel's surprised face swam into focus, wreathed in a halo of lamp glow. "What on earth are you doing here, dear? Come in out of that downpour before you catch your death." Evelyn crossed the threshold into a scene out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Delicious aromas of baking suffused the air, and a crackling fire cast flickering lights over chintz armchairs and tatted lace doilies. But beneath that veneer of grandmotherly wholesomeness, Evelyn sensed the squirming rot. The sigils from the book danced in her mind's eye, exposing the putrid reality beneath the flesh. Mabel's kindly smile stretched into a rictus of obscene hunger. Her eyes, boiling black pits, shot through with malevolent stars. "Where's Lila?" Evelyn fought to keep her voice steady, her hand from creeping to the service weapon at her hip. "Why? In the kitchen helping me bake pies for the Founders' Day celebration at the library," Mabel said. She cocked her head, and the shadows shivered like pustulant flesh. "Is everything all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I know what you are." The words came out in a rush, sharp as knives. "I know about the pact, the ravening dark. What this town does to innocent children in the name of those things." Mabel's face didn't change, but the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost rimed the windows and the shadows grew long, twisting into shapes of Stygian horror. "Oh, Evelyn!" The old woman's voice was a cloying croon, sweet as rotted fruit. "I had such hopes for you. Thought you might be different, that you might understand the necessity of it all, the beauty and the terror." "You're insane." Evelyn's hand inched closer to her holster, sweat prickling her brow despite the supernatural chill. "All of you, with your sick blood cult. But it ends now. I'm taking my daughter and we're leaving this God-forsaken town forever." Mabel's chuckle was like the scuttle of grave beetles. "Oh, my sweet summer child, you have no idea the forces you're trifling with. There is no escape from the ravening dark. Lila's fate was sealed the moment you set foot in Maple Grove, as is yours." Her form rippled, seemed to grow and swell in the curdling shadows. The room yawned into a cavernous maw lined with pulsing obsidian flesh, the geometry of the space warping in non-Euclidean madness. "You cannot fight the hungry ones, dearie," crooned the thing that wore Mabel's face, its voice the buzzing of a billion hellish flies. "You can only offer yourself up. Let them fill the aching void at the center of your broken little soul. Surrender, and know the ecstasy of annihilation, of union with the outer gods." Revulsion and terror seized Evelyn, froze the breath in her lungs. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee this obscene non-space and the squamous horrors it contained. But then a small, terrified voice cut through the chaos, yanking her back from the brink. "Mommy!" Lila stood in the doorway, face white and eyes huge with terror. She clutched a stuffed rabbit, her small body trembling like a leaf. "Mommy, what's happening? I'm scared." The sight of her daughter, so small and helpless before the immensity of the dark, ignited a fire in Evelyn's veins, a white-hot rage, a mother's wrath that made the eldritch shadows recoil. She whirled on the hideous parody of Mabel, drawing down on it with righteous fury. Her eyes blazed with conviction, with the desperate, indomitable love only a parent could know. "Get away from my daughter, you bitch!" The shot thundered in that enclosed space, the muzzle flash searing away the darkness. The thing that had been Mabel shrieked, ichor spraying from a ragged hole in its center mass. Evelyn charged through the collapsing illusion, snatching Lila up and crushing her to her chest. Then she was running, fleeing that house of horrors as the world shattered and reformed around her. Out into the rain, the sky screaming and reality buckling at the seams. Toward the charnel grounds of the mining settlement, unholy sigils burning behind her eyes. To perform a ritual no sane mind could conceive and pay the price for her daughter's soul. The abyss yawned, hungry and waiting, and Evelyn plunged into its depths. Lila clutched tight, the tome a lead weight in her arms, toward salvation or damnation. God help them all. Chapter 12. The storm raged, the wind a banshee's howl as Evelyn raced through the ruined streets of the old mining town. Rain lashed her face, plastered her hair to her skull, but she barely felt it. All her attention was focused on the precious bundle in her arms, on shielding Lila from the primal chaos that clawed at the edges of reality. The little girl clung to her, face buried in Evelyn's neck. She shook like a leaf, whimpers of terror lost in the gale. Evelyn's heart shattered, even as a feral resolve crystallized in her veins. "It's going to be okay, baby," she murmured against Lila's rain-soaked hair. "Mommy's going to make it all okay. I promise." The words tasted like lies, like ashes on her tongue. How could anything ever be okay again after the horrors they'd witnessed? The veil had been ripped away, exposing the squirming obscenities that lurked beneath the skin of the world. There was no going back from that, no unseeing the abyss. But she had to try. For Lila, for the innocent soul counting on her, she had to stare into that void and not blink. Had to be the shield against the ravening dark, no matter the cost to herself. Evelyn's boots pounded rotting boards as she sprinted toward the old miners' hall. The building loomed from the rain-lashed gloom, a hulking sepulchre of desecrated faith. Sickly light spilled from the gaping doorway, pulsing in time to the shuddersome vibrations that shook the earth. The vibrations of an eldritch horror stirring, an ancient malevolence flexing its tendrils across space-time. Evelyn felt it in her bones, in the madness skittering corners of her mind. The ravening dark, the hungry ones, straining against the gossamer veil of reality, slavering to break through and sate their eternal hunger. And at the center of that maelstrom, the charnel pit from which the corruption spewed like pus from a lanced boil, the altar room, where generations of innocence had been shattered and devoured, their agony a sacrifice to gods that should never be woken, where even now the order prepared their final rite, the ritual that would crack the world like an egg and loose the outer dark to feast. Evelyn crashed through the desecrated hall, Lila bouncing in her arms. The tome, that damnable Revelations of Glaki, was a lead weight under her slicker, its dread inscriptions searing through cloth and skin to brand her soul. It held the key, the ritual of severing that could cut the threads binding Maple Grove to the shadow. But the cost, sweet Jesus, the cost. No, she wouldn't think of that, not now, with the abyss yawning before her and Lila trembling in her arms. One thing at a time, one foot in front of the other, into the dark, into the nightmare, to face the hungry ones and decide the fate of the world. Eldritch light shivered ahead, the stomach-churning luminance of an inverted sun. It spilled from the gaping maw of the altar room, painting the hall in shades of bruise and rot. Evelyn stumbled to a halt at the threshold, breath stoppered in her throat. They were waiting for her. 13 of them, arranged in a crescent before the altar stone. 13 pillars of the community, faces she knew and had trusted, now twisted into rictuses of obscene ecstasy. Sheriff Swanson, Mayor Tremblay, Reverend Harding. And at the center of that eldritch tableau, the principal of Lila's school, a man who had greeted her with smiles and called her Pumpkin. Now he stood naked save for a cloak of flayed human skin, viscera glistening in the pulsing light. A jagged blade of volcanic glass glittered in his hand, edges dark with old blood. His eyes were boiling black pits, windows into an infinite abyss of malice. "Welcome, Sheriff," he crooned, voice buzzing with the drone of a billion hellish flies. "You're just in time for the celebration, the summoning, the cracking of the world, the long-awaited return of our masters." Lila whimpered, burrowing deeper into Evelyn's arms. Evelyn clutched her close, shielding her from the horrible sight. Fury and revulsion warred in her veins, a hot tide that threatened to burst her skull. "Go to hell," she spat. "You're not touching my daughter, you sick fucks. Not now, not ever." The principal's chuckle was like the scuttle of grave beetles. "Oh, but we are, Sheriff. Little Lila is the key, the innocent vessel. Her blood will open the way, and her body will be the conduit for the glory of the outer gods. It is her destiny, inscribed in the stars and the spaces between since before time began." He raised the obsidian blade, a perverted salute. Around him the order began to chant, a guttural atonal drone that set Evelyn's teeth on edge and made colors bleed at the edge of her vision. "Ea! Ea! Shub-Niggurath! The black goat of the woods with 1,000 young!" The name was a hook in Evelyn's brain, a wrenching wrongness that made her want to scream and gibber. But she pushed it down, fixing her mind on Lila's slight weight in her arms, the terrified thrum of her daughter's heart. Her hand drifted to the butt of her service weapon. She knew it was useless against the horrors she faced, but it steadied her nonetheless. A talisman of the world she knew, the life she'd sworn to protect. In her mind's eye, the diagrams from the revelations burned like cold fire. The ritual of severing, the steps she must complete to cut the strings binding Maple Grove to the dark. The terrible price she must pay. Slowly, with dreamlike calm, she set Lila down, took her tiny face in trembling hands and pressed a kiss to her brow, tasting salt and rainwater. "Be brave, baby. Be brave for Mommy. It's going to be okay." Then she rose, shrugging out of her rain-soaked slicker, reached under her shirt and withdrew her most sacred duty, her highest calling, the revelations of Glaaki, that damnable tome, and the key to Maple Grove's salvation, or its final damnation. "No," Evelyn said, her voice ringing clear over the chanting. "No more. This ends now." She strode forward, the tome held before her like a shield. The eldritch light played over its pitted leather cover, the sigils writhing in obscene welcome. The principal's eyes widened, the first hint of uncertainty flickering in those fathomless pits. "What is this? What do you think you're doing?" "Ending it," Evelyn said. She reached the edge of the glyphs inscribed on the floor, the non-Euclidean angles that made her gorge rise. "Your pact, your power over this town and its people. I'm breaking the chains, severing the connection to the hungry ones." She raised the tome, flipping it open to the final page. The words there burned like cold fire, searing her eyes, her mind, her very soul. But she pushed through the agony, fixing her gaze on the principal's slowly dawning horror. "No," he whispered, dread cracking his voice. "You can't. You don't know what you're doing, the consequences." "I know." Evelyn's smile was a rictus, a death's head grin. "I know the price, and I gladly pay it for Lila, for all the innocence you've destroyed in service to your masters." She began to read, the words tearing at her throat like razors. The air shivered, convulsed, as if in the grip of a seizure. The sigils on the floor flared with sickly radiance, pulsing in time to the rhythm of her chant. Around her the order screamed, a ululation of fury and terror. They fell to their knees, clawing at their faces, their eyes as the ritual took hold. Blood poured from their mouths, their noses, their ears, a crimson tide that pooled and smoked on the writhing floor. And beyond, in the spaces between, Evelyn felt the hungry ones howl, felt their rage, their desperation, as the threads of the pact began to fray and snap, one by one. The revelations of Glaaki shook in her hands, the pages flipping of their own accord, faster and faster until they were a blur. The chant rose to a crescendo, the words blurring into a single scream of defiance and release. Evelyn poured everything into them, her love for Lila, her hatred of the darkness, her desperate, clawing need to protect and serve. And with a final, wrenching snap, the pact shattered. Silence thundered, so absolute it was like a physical blow. Evelyn staggered, the tome tumbling from nerveless fingers. The altar room was an abattoir, the order reduced to mounds of shredded meat and splintered bone. Beyond, in the writhing dark, Evelyn sensed a vast and terrible absence. The hungry ones, cut off, banished back to the abyss that spawned them. Maple Grove was free, purged of their corruption. But the price. Oh God, the price. Evelyn looked down at her hands, watched in numb horror as the flesh began to blacken and peel. The ritual had demanded a vessel, a willing sacrifice to bear the pack's sundering, and she had offered herself, knowingly and without hesitation. A life for a life, a soul for a soul, hers in place of Lila's. Agony exploded through her, drove her to her knees. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a gout of oily black fluid emerged. She could feel the void taking her, hollowing her out cell by cell to make room for the outer dark. But it was worth it. Lila was safe. Maple Grove was free, the innocent protected, the monsters slain or banished. She had done her duty, upheld her oath. She was content. "Mommy!" Lila's scream cut through the roaring in her ears. Evelyn lifted her head, vision swimming with shadows. Her daughter stood in the doorway, eyes huge with horror and incomprehension. With the last of her strength, Evelyn smiled, reached out a hand that was more void than flesh, a final farewell. "It's okay, baby," she whispered through cracked and bleeding lips. "It's okay. Mommy loves you. Mommy will always love." The void took her, and Sheriff Evelyn Hayes knew no more. Epilogue, 500 words. Sunlight dappled the green grass of Maple Grove Cemetery, the sky a cloudless bowl of azure overhead. Birds sang in the trees, and a warm breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut hay. Lila Hayes knelt before a simple granite marker, a bunch of wildflowers clutched in her small fist. Tears streaked her face, but her eyes were clear, free of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. "Hi, Mommy," she whispered, laying the flowers at the base of the headstone. "I miss you." A gentle hand landed on her shoulder, and she looked up into the careworn face of Mayor Swift. The woman had aged a decade in the month since the horror at the old miners' hall, her hair more gray than brown, new lines bracketing her mouth and eyes. But the eyes themselves were kind, brimming with compassion and shared grief. She had been Evelyn's staunchest ally in the days after, shielding Lila from the fallout and the vultures from the big city papers who had descended en masse at the first whiff of scandal. "Your mother was a hero, Lila," the mayor said softly. "She saved us all, saved you. Never forget that." Lila nodded, a wobbly smile quirking her lips. "I won't. She's with the angels now, watching over us." "That she is, Pumpkin, that she is." Mayor Swift squeezed her shoulder, blinking back tears of her own. Together they stood, hand in hand, and walked from the quiet cemetery into the warm and waiting light. Behind them the headstone glinted in the sun, its inscription stark against the pale stone. Evelyn Hayes' beloved mother, dedicated sheriff, she stood against the dark and paid the price for our salvation. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. John 15:13. And in the shadows of the trees, in the spaces between, something vast and terrible and impossibly ancient watched them go, and began the long wait for the stars to align once more. Up to the end.